This manhwa begins with a man who sits on a throne and appears to be settling a dispute between two powerful men, the Count of Seoul Cheddar, and the Prince of Trico's Ruts over Lady Heir. The Count confesses that she's a woman he's loved for a long time and seeks permission to take her as his wife, but the prince interrupts him asking if he can't just choose from one of the other 5 princesses. That woman is the one I like the most, he argues. The other ladies present gush at how both the prince and the count want Princess Heir. Count Cheddar has long been in love with the princess and is famous for being romantic, but since our country suffered a crushing defeat trying to invade the Trico's empire, the emperor promised to offer one of the princesses as a peace offering along with war compensation. Who will His Majesty offer the princess to? The people watching ask while Heir walks up to the men thinking, I already know the answer to this question because it's something I experienced in my previous life. On a snowy night, a lady who appears to be pregnant with dark brown hair rides in a carriage with her maid Da, who checks on her to see if she's okay. She assures Da she's okay while the maid rants about how cruel it is to send a lady in her final months of pregnancy on such a perilous journey, but the lady assures her it's okay since she also has no desire to give birth in that house. However, her maid pushes further, asking how she would have any desire to give birth in the house where her husband blatantly sleeps with his mistress while she's heavily pregnant. The lady warns Da not to speak of him in such a manner and says she's only happy to be having her child. She's about to finish her statement when the carriage stops and the guard pulls the carriage door open and orders her to get out. Da demands to know why he would ask them to get out in the snow, and the guard replies that they need to repair the carriage. Once they get out, he orders the maid to remain behind and then tries to pull the lady along, but she struggles, asking if they've forgotten that she carries their master's child in her wombs. I haven't forgotten, a familiar voice that brings her to a pause says. The man standing tells her that's why he didn't want to go that far, while she calls him with tears pouring from her eyes. Why are you here? She asks. The man suddenly grabs her by her shoulder, and as she slowly retreats he tells her Isabel insists on becoming his official wife, so he also has no choice. They reach the edge of the cliff, and as the ice slowly cracks under her feet she asks what he plans to do since she still carries his child in her wombs. You and that child must disappear, Heir. His solid grip slips away, sending her tumbling forward, and as her feet leave the cliff's edge, time seems to pause as she takes one more look at her supposed husband who'd betrayed her trust. But that's not the end. She wakes up from this terrible nightmare and instinctively feels her stomach for her child when Da comes in and asks if she perhaps had a nightmare. The maid informs her that they're coming to obtain the war compensation from Trico's, so the palace is in chaos, and then suggests that was probably why she had a nightmare. Curious, Heir asks if the prince has come again, but her maid confirms if it isn't the first time he's coming there. The maid explains that the king had promised to give one of the princesses as part of the peace agreement, so he has come to take his bride. However, in Heir's memory, that happened 2 years ago, and her eyes fill again with hope as she realizes that she's returned to the past. The present day, the second prince of the Trico's empire Ritzviant arrives with a fierce gaze whilst the people gossip about how he's a war demon who goes mad at the sight of blood. They discuss how if it hadn't been for the prince they wouldn't have lost the war, and neither would they have to offer a peace offering. Heir stands in the balcony reflecting on how 2 years ago everyone had thought the prince held no real power as he wasn't even a crown prince, so they pitted the princess who would become his wife, but only her knows that the crown prince of the Trico's empire would soon die from an illness, and in the succession struggle, Ritzviant will win. He will become the emperor of the Trico's empire, and the princess of Seoul, who he chose as a peace offering, will become the empress of the Trico's empire, while she will die at the hands of her husband, Count Cheddar. He claimed to love her, but he cheated as soon as she got pregnant, and even though she lost his love, she wanted to protect her child. She immediately turns to Da and orders her to take out all the clothes and accessories from the wardrobe. There are guests at the palace, so I need to prepare well, and even more since they are here to choose a bride. Her maid, unaware of the thought behind her sudden request, asks if she isn't going to be marrying the count anyways since there are 5 princesses, so the king wouldn't really send her to Trico's. Da reassures her that no matter how indifferent the king is to her, he will make sure she marries someone who will love her wholeheartedly. Heir agrees with her and explains that because of the astronomical taxes that come from the Count's mines, he will be sure to give him the woman he wants without hesitation, and since it isn't arrogant for a Count of Chester's status to desire her, a half-blood princess who was born from a maidservant, the Emperor will surely give her to him as his wife. She turns to Da and asks if there isn't something more provocative to wear and more extravagant accessories. As she wears her earring, she thinks, this time she wouldn't believe in love like she did before, and it wouldn't matter whether anyone loves her, but she will be sure to protect her child and make him the crown prince of the empire. In this life, I will change my and my child's fate with my own power. In a new scene, Heir has a meal with her mom to celebrate her birthday, but her mom notices she's zoned out. Her mother used to be a maid in the palace, but because of her pretty face she was dragged into the king's chambers and became a concubine after conceiving her. Her mom speaks of the Count and says he seems likely to propose formally soon. She tells her she's heard not only the noblewomen but the other princesses are infatuated with the Count. Her mom also asks if it isn't something to be grateful for that he adores her daughter regardless of her low-born mother's bloodline. However, Heir reflects on how in her past life she was of the same opinion, so she was happy to receive his proposal and was also very grateful, but after she knows what he'll do to her, she's determined to make sure the second prince proposes to her. She recalls how the people had mentioned he was a murderer interested in nothing but blood and war, and he also hasn't shown himself since entering the palace. Heir recalls how in the past after her mother's birthday there was an unforgettable incident because the prince lived someone in the palace. In a new scene, Heir discusses with a man how something if the prince has gone missing and the vice-captain appeared to be their suspect. She explains that the prince is missing an almoner with the goddess's figure embroidered on its outer surface and purple gemstones set in her eyes. Heir reveals that at the moment it is in his possession, which drives him to freeze in panic. She also reflects on how in the past the man stole it and got caught the next day, which resulted in his death, but in that life she will use the piece of information to change the situation. She assures the man that she's only there to clear up any misunderstandings, and if he gives her the item she will go to the prince and explain that she'd found the item in the West Palace. I'll say I was the one who found it, I won't mention you at all, Heir finishes. He reluctantly hands it to Heir and pleads with her to explain things well without any misunderstandings, and then bows before leaving. Heir sighs a breath of relief, happy that it's done, before taking a closer look at it. Heir recalls how the people had discussed that the prince treasures the almoner greatly and doesn't like to part with it, not even for a moment. She recalls rumors that it was a keepsake from his late mother and wonders if using the item might give her a chance to meet and speak with him. As she deliberates on the intensity of her goal, out of nowhere a sword points at her neck. I was going to kill the thief on the spot once I found him, but what could be the reason that a princess of this country would cover for a mere thief? I was too curious to kill him. To her surprise, she finds the second prince standing in front of her with his sword aimed at her. As she trembles, she asks how he'd gotten in, but the prince soon goes mad from watching the almoner in her hand. He suddenly lunges at her, and as she retreats, she ends up falling onto the bed with the prince with a settled look of confusion on her face. The prince's eye color changes as he yanks the almoner from her hand. He continues squeezing it until he calms down, and as he gets up he thinks it's a relief that he found it before anyone got killed. Heir notices him pick up his sword and, overcome by the fear of her being accused of theft and ending up unalived in the hands of the only man who could change her fate. Panic sets in and Heir calls out to the prince as she explains that she wasn't trying to steal the item or hide it, and instead she was planning on giving it back to him the next day after preparing herself properly. The prince, curious as to why she would cover for a thief, asks if perhaps the man is her secret lover, but she denies it and explains that she was only worried that if he'd acted and unalized him due to a misunderstanding it might lead to further conflicts between nations. The prince scoffs at her tearful patriotism and then asks why she didn't try to stop their foolish attempts to invade the empire if she was truly concerned about the country. He sits on a chair and then says the smell of the Saur soldier's blood that he'd shed during battle is still vivid. Heir stays quiet for a while before responding that Saur must make amends for daring to covet the territory of the Trika's empire and shedding blood in vain. She tells him her father has promised the Emperor of Tricos that he would offer one of the princesses as a peace offering. The prince confirms it and explains that it seems he was reluctant to give up Princess Sayla, so instead he offered the Canal City and a daughter. He tells her he heard there are 5 princesses born to the 5 concubines of Saur and then proceeds to ask if she's one of them, and he says yes. Heir asks the prince if there's a particular woman that he desires, and he responds that he hasn't really given it any thought. "So please choose me," she declares, leaving the prince puzzled. She explains that she was planning to visit him the next day to request that, and if he chooses her she'll do whatever he requires. Finally his face breaks into a smirk as he admits that he was annoyed with his father for asking him to marry a daughter from the defeated country after their victory in the war, but she's quite interesting. He picks up a match and lights the candles, and after taking a proper look at her he says the war's compensation is quite unique, a proposal from a woman kneeling in just her underwear. Her face turns red as she instinctively crosses her arms over her chest, but his response to her reaction is bland. "What are you hiding? You want to be my wife? Then you'd better entertain me more if you want to win my heart." Consumed with the thought to change her fate no matter what, she gets up, and as she slips the dress she tells him if unpredictability is what excites him she'll be more than happy to comply. The prince's eye widens in shock as the dress comes off completely and she stands in front of him with her gaze somewhere else. As the prince looks as though unable to grasp the situation, Heir asks, "Does this side of me pique your interest?" The prince lets out a laugh with his face buried in his palm, and as he unclips his cloak he tells her she really has a knack for making people curious. He finally takes it off, and as she stands wondering what to do as he approaches her, he throws it to her. "It has been interesting, but I didn't come all the way here just to look at a woman's naked body. Turn around," he finishes. The prince demands to know the reason why she would go that far, saying that's the reason he's keeping her alive. She finally reveals that there's a man who wants to propose to her and her father will probably give her away to him. "I don't want that." The prince asks why she wouldn't just refuse his proposal, and she replies that it's because she doesn't have a choice. "Your Highness Prince of the Empire of Tricos, unless you choose me first and make me your wife," Heir says. The prince tells her she must really despise the man, but as he walks to her he tells her it's a very dangerous gamble. It's like avoiding a tiger only to end up in a dragon's jaws. He tells her he's heard that rumors about him have even reached Sal. He tells her since birth he's been more like a beast than a human in his ferocity, a madman who cannot even recognize his own kin and attacks recklessly, a murderer who finds more pleasure in spilling blood than in embracing women, so they say he ends. However, she's unfazed. She tells the prince she has something she must ask of him, and he asks what it is while still maintaining his cold look. She tells him she will bear his child since producing an heir is also part of a wife's duty and he doesn't need to love her. "Just promise that the child I bear is protected as your heir. If you can promise that, I'll ask for nothing more." As they discuss, they pause when they hear Da ask if she should come up to close the window, but Heir refuses her help, immediately saying she'll take care of it herself. However, the prince puts out the light and tells her to come by to the Western Palace by noon the next day and he'll give her his answer by then. The prince places his hand on the balcony before sliding off, but when Heir goes to check on him she spots him in perfect condition. The next day at the Western Palace, she arrives bearing a gift. As she worries whether the prince will accept her proposal, the queen arrives declaring that she'd heard rumors that the emperor is quite handsome and the palace maids were lingering in tacky attire, so she'd come to put things right, but she didn't expect a princess to be at the forefront. Heir greets them calmly while they gossip about her having poor manners and accuse her of trying to seduce the Emperor of Tricos with her body. They mention how her mother had changed her fate through her body and conclude that it's no wonder she learnt to do the same. Heir reflects on how her mother was dragged away by the drunken king and lived her life in humiliation ever since, and that's why she must have wanted her to marry a man who would truly love her. They are interrupted by a Rhett's assistant who announces that he's awaiting his guest. He greets Heir and offers to escort her to the prince's location. Heir finally meets the prince and offers a gift to apologize for her rudeness the day before. She attempts to introduce herself, but he dismisses it, saying he's not interested in names. Regarding yesterday's answer, I have a condition as well. If you answer all of them, I will make you my wife, he says. She asks what he wants, but he responds with a question about her fiancé Cheddar Phil. He tells her everyone seems to think of him as her fiancé, adding that he's quite a famous count who deeply adores her, so why does she dislike him? The prince makes her understand that if by chance she's aiming for the position of the imperial crown princess, she'll be making a mistake, since objectively marrying the count and becoming a countess would be much better than a life with him. She explains to the prince that she isn't looking for a comfortable marriage, and when he asks why, she responds that it's a reason she can't disclose, and even if she did tell him, he wouldn't understand. Her mind drifts to the moment the count had pushed her off the cliff in the past, and she thinks he wouldn't believe her anyway. Heir tells the prince what she wants is to serve him as his wife, and if he accepts her, she'll fulfill all her duties as a loyal wife. The prince once again clarifies that marrying him would only give her the empty title of crown princess and nothing else. He also tells her as a duty they might produce an heir, but beyond that he has no intentions of engaging with her more than necessary or getting close. The prince lastly states that other than bearing his child, she wouldn't ask any other thing from him, and even if she does bear an heir, they wouldn't hold any real power in their hands. The prince states that that's his condition and asks if she can accept it, and with a bright smile she says yes. They come to terms with each other, and he informs her that he'll propose to her the next day, and she promises to dedicate everything to serving him. He dismisses her, and she steps out to find Da waiting, anxious for information from their discussion. Heir tells her the conversation had gone well and praises the prince's looks, which prompts Da to ask what if the count gets jealous, since they are to be married soon. The next day, as Da gets her ready, she informs her that she'd borrowed a piece of jewelry from her mother. It was a gift from the king to her mother, the only gift her father ever gave her, and she lent it to her. Later, when Heir gets out, she runs into the king's legitimate daughter, Syria, and the other princesses, who mock her change in style by asking if she's dressed like that because she's so nervous that the count might not propose after all. Heir watches them leave with a feeling of exhaustion when a man creeps up behind her. Cheddar compliments her look, unable to take his eyes off her. She tries to fold her arm across her chest, but he spots the cut on her hand and immediately pulls her. "What's this wound?" he demands, but she assures him that it's nothing but a small cut from a branch, hiding that it's the scar from the almoner that never healed since that night. He insists on reprimanding her servants, questioning how they could let their mistress' body be married. "A scar on your flawless skin, it pains me deeply." However, Heir is only disgusted by the feeling and pulls away from his grip. The people around notice them, and the count asks Heir if he'd done something to make her uncomfortable. However, suddenly a familiar voice, "There you are, Heir." The prince arrives and reveals how he's been looking for her. He takes her hand, spotting her injury, and asks if it's because of him before kissing her hand. Revolted by this intimate interaction, the count snatches her hand away from the prince, and when asked what he's doing, he boasts that the customs in the north must be very different from Saur. In Saur it's impolite to kiss someone's hand unless you're close, especially for a woman. However, the prince replies that he didn't know that, since the people who appear to value etiquette so much are the same ones who invaded someone else's land without a declaration of war. And now some mere noble dares to interrupt the prince of the empire greeting the princess of his own country. "Should I take this as a sign that Tricus has no intention of making peace?" he asks. The emperor arrives at the banquet to find the mood around the two gentlemen tense. Prince Viant speaks first and explains that he'd heard that during the banquet he is supposed to give the princess of Saur to him, and he'd like to make his choice then. However, Cheddar speaks, reminding the king that they'd previously had a discussion and he'd promised to give him his answer the day of the banquet. "I wish to marry Princess Heir." Prince Viant tells him it's so unfortunate and asks what can be done since he's already chosen his princess. The emperor then asks if they both want Heir, and Cheddar explains that she's a woman he's loved for a long time and asks for his permission to have her as his wife. "Isn't it about choosing a princess I like out of the 5, this woman is the one I like the most." At this point the emperor lets out a sigh, thinking he can't risk offending the notorious empire, and at the same time he also can't break his promise to the count. The emperor, after thinking, then suggests the prince meets all of the 5 princesses before making a decision, since it might be too hasty to decide without proper meeting. "Oh, before making my decision, I need to receive this fellow's apology," the prince states. The prince tells them he hadn't taken enough lives during the war and had originally intended to burn down the palace of Salwar and then drag all the 5 princesses and illegitimate daughters back as slaves, but he'd held back at his father's command, and even after, a count from a defeated nation dares to mock him, the prince of a victorious empire. The prince reports that he'd interrupted him even before he finished speaking. Fearing the dangers of the peace treaty falling through, the king orders the count to properly apologize to the prince for his rudeness at the peacemaking gathering. Count Phil tenders an apology and pleads that he quells his anger and enjoy the banquet, while the prince turns to Heir, saying there's only one way he can enjoy the banquet. He pulls her in by her weights and declares that by taking the woman he chooses as his wife, he might be able to overlook a mere count from Salwar Empire acting arrogant, if only he gets that wogs fulfilled. Heir's mother interrupts, pleading with the king not to. However, the prince opts to clear all misunderstandings by stating that he isn't taking her to torment her. He explains that he'd lost something of value the previous day, and only with her help was he able to retrieve it, so she's practically his benefactor, so he'll treat her with care and respect even when he takes her back with him to Tricos. "She's the only thing in this country that I like." The emperor finally gives in and explains to her that she's going to Tricos for the sake of peace between the 2 countries. The prince notices the look of displeasure on the count's face and apologizes for briefly stealing the princess he was betrothed to, and then suggests he arrange a match for him there as well. The emperor welcomes this suggestion and permits him to choose a princess that pleases his heart and takes her as his wife. However, he still argues that Heir is the only woman he wants, but the prince's harsh tone and look that utters, "chose" drives him pale. He finally accepts the condition and points at a princess that leaves Heir in shock. "He chosen mine, the bride of the prince in the past," making her question whether fate has been reversed. The prince notices her expression and puts his arm around her, explaining that she seems surprised by the sudden proposal, so he'll go talk with her outside. They get into the garden and he tells her he thinks he's done all she requested and asks if there's any problem. She tells him there's none and explains that she was only overcome with emotion at the thought that she wouldn't have to marry the count. She thanks him for listening to her request and he says all right. She notices him lying on the bench and asks if he's sleeping, and he responds that it's so hot and he's getting sleepy. A pregnant couple passes by and Heir notices by her bump that she'll be in her final stages of pregnancy. Her mind drifts off to how exciting the thought of meeting her baby was, and only when the prince asks if she's crying does she notice. The prince asks why she's crying since she'd stated there wasn't any problem, and she tells him she was only thinking about her mother and must have cried without realizing it. The prince asks if her mother was the concubine who turned pale the moment he proposed to her, and she says yes. She tells him her mother used to be a palace maid and she gave birth to her and became a concubine, but she wasn't favored by the king. She tells him she was only worried her mother might have a harder time in the palace without her. The prince then asks if the reason they call her a half-princess is because her biological mother was a maid, and she says yes. The prince sucks his teeth, saying he doesn't like that. He doesn't like the fact that I'm half-princess. Should I not have said anything? Hino questions until she hears the prince ask if a guy who drunk on his power as king drags a woman to bed by force isn't a complete bastard. He tells her everyone was nicking and insulting her and her mother, while the one who caused the trouble is someone else, but the blame is being taken in the wrong place. There's nothing I like about this country, from the weather to its culture, everything. He tells her they'll leave right after the wedding ceremony and then suggests she spend some time with her mother before that, because once he leaves for Tricos he has no intention of returning there. "Let's call it a day, it's even hotter outside," he says with his hand extended forward. She accepts his gesture, and lastly he tells her not to cry in front of people, as it would seem like he's forcibly dragging along someone who doesn't like him. "It wasn't worth pretending to be deeply in love with you." He asks her if she truly believes everything he'd said at the banquet hall to be true, since he has to prove in front of everyone that she who is rumored to be engaged is given to him. He tells her it would be natural to at least pretend to have fallen in love at first sight and asks if it wouldn't be better than crying if her mother believes that her daughter was taken away by a barbarian from the north. Heir then asks the prince if he's perhaps concerned about her mother, but his response is bland as he tells her he doesn't enjoy women crying. She thanks him for his warm consideration, and again he tells her he didn't do it out of consideration for her since they came as a peace delegation, so they had no choice but to resolve it without drawing their swords. When she goes inside, she spots Mia, who congratulates her on her wedding and also apologizes, saying who would have thought she and the count would get married. Heir tells her it's not something she should feel sorry about, assuring her that she's the one the count has chosen. On the contrary, Hinali tells her she must have been surprised to suddenly get married, but she responds that she was surprised but at the same time happy, as she'd been thinking about it for a long time that she wants to marry someone like Count Phil. As she buries her face in her pram, she tells Heir it was nothing but a dream she had when she was young, but she never thought it would come true like that. Their conversation is interrupted by the count, who asks to speak with Heir for a while in a quiet place. When they're alone together, she congratulates him on his marriage and pleads that he takes care of Mia, but he tells her he doesn't want to hear her congratulations now. "Tell me after I win you back." She slowly retreats as she asks if that's his decision. He tells her to wait for him as he stretches his hand forward. "I will definitely save you, you're mine, Heir," he says. Heibel turns her head and asks if he's drunk, saying she'll pretend she didn't hear what he just said. As he walks, she wonders if it could be that he meant he would chase her. From nowhere the prince arrives and asks why she's sweating so much. She takes advantage of the situation and says she was looking for him and she wanted to continue the conversation they were having earlier. As she hesitates to speak, the prince looks up ahead to find Cheddar and asks if the look at a girl who would become someone else's wife has to be so vicious. He tells her he would show him properly and then takes her hand and announces to the emperor that they would share a dance together as his bride looks bored. The emperor is in full support, so he suggests if it wouldn't be nicer if two soon-to-be married couples dance together. The emperor agrees and the two couples begin dancing. The people around praise the prince's features, and when he turns her around and her gaze meets Cheddar, she thinks of how great it would be if he gave up on chasing her. Cheddar stares at Heir without paying any attention to his soon-to-be bride. "I know why you hate that man, what a disgusting person, he gives me a headache," the prince says to Heir. Heir pleads with him to bear with her for a bit, but he insists that she's the one who's going to hold on. He grabs her by her waist and holds her midair for a while. She gets flustered and asks him to let her down, and he agrees, but he drops her on his feet. He tells her he'd let her down already. "I want to see you closer, Heir." They maintain eye contact, pulling the attention of the others that they praise the boldness of the northern men, but Cheddar only looks at them with more hostility. The prince looks at him with a smirk, lifts Heir's head and kisses her in front of everyone. Heir looks at the prince shocked and finally gives in when she thinks maybe acting like that would make Cheddar give up. The people around gossip about the northerners being blatant in showing affection, which only frustrates the only legitimate daughter of the emperor. The people also question if it's love at first sight, since the prince doesn't even look at other ladies while Cheddar looks in defeat. In a new scene, they hold their wedding ceremony in the temple. The priest takes a willow barn, apparently symbolizing life, and ties around both their wrists. The prince, sensing her trembling hand, asks why she's shaking, and she apologizes, saying she must be too nervous. The grand priest attempts to burn the willow bark, but as he raises his hand above the prince's, he senses a dark energy from him and orders that Nuska's tears be brought instantly. A young priest is confused about the need for a holy relic. Another priest asks if perhaps there's a problem with the ritual, and the grand priest hesitates before revealing that he'd sensed a trace of dark magic from the prince. The priests around begin panicking, and the grand priest commands that assuming the dark magic is in the prince's body, they wouldn't be able to get married. "This is the first time I've been tricked in such a ridiculous way," he says before bringing out the almoner. The prince then says the marriage is nothing more than a gift from the defeated nation, and then asks if he could conclude that calling off the marriage is a way to avoid taking accountability for the war. The Grand Priest remains unfazed and instead splashes the water from the holy relic on the prince. Look, when holy water and dark magic meet, smoke will rise. I've lived my whole life according to Lord Nesca's will. I've never made a mistake after receiving omnipotent power, Prince Viant speaks. The Grand Priest is hesitant and the prince says, religious mistakes aren't his business, but diplomatically he must take responsibility. The High Priest insists on doing it again, but the prince interrupts, asking him not to humiliate him any further. The other priests, noticing his mistake, urges him to apologize immediately to the prince, and he wipes his face as an apology. Later at the West Palace office, the prince informs his assistant that they'll have to leave immediately. He rips off his shirt with a bloody hand and it gets his assistant's attention. The prince asks if compared to the black smoke rising from his face it isn't better. The prince then explains that after serving the gods for a long time, the Grand Priest has developed an exceptional awareness of evil energy. He possesses a keen sense of perception. He even recognized the state of my physical condition. His assistant hurriedly asks if he'd worn the almoner and he says yes. The prince replies that he crashed straight into Majingseek to absorb the cloak, and thanks to that he wasn't detected. His assistant reminds him that they can't let the royal family's secrets leak out, and the prince replies that he knows, but they have to leave immediately. His assistant asks if before departing they should meet with the king first, and he scoffs. His assistant brings up the princess and he asks if that is important at the moment before passing out. In a new scene, Heir reveals that the prince would leave the next day, as it appears that his mood was ruined by what happened at the wedding ceremony. Hinali continues and says he sent a message that he would leave the next day. Her mom asks out loud if that day would be her last with her, and then proceeds to grab her hand before asking if it would be okay, since it is said that Tricos is a cold and barren place. Heir reassures her mom, reminding her how much the prince cherishes her. Her mom calls her name and then pulls out a small box and says she was wondering whether she should give that to her or not. Her mother tells her she believes it would be more beneficial for her to keep it rather than her. She's confused and her mom explains that it is something her brother found for her a long time ago. She heard that if she used the medicine she would gain the king's favor, but was unable to use it herself. Heibel reflects on how in the past her mother had given that to her when she married Cheddar, with instruction to use it when a person changes their heart. After a few months of marriage, Cheddar began to lose interest in her, and as a result of worry she used the medicine to change his heart, but thanks to it she became pregnant, and because of that she couldn't sleep with him. She grips the box tightly and then thanks her mom. She hugs her mom and says that she should take care of her health and she'll write a letter to her. The next day in front of the delegation, the emperor reminds her not to forget her role since he'd given her to Tricos in exchange for peace. She promises to try her best, and before she leaves, the emperor informs her that the prince had left the previous day. He tells her it seems he became really angry and left because of the high priest, and then asks her to persuade him. She goes to her mom, who reminds her to send her letters, but just as she's about to get in the carriage, Mia calls her and rushes to her. She tells her she's always wanted to get closer to her, and Heir responds that they could still get closer and then asks if she'll also exchange letters with her. Lastly, they share a hug as Mia agrees to write to her. In the carriage, Heir tells Da, who's in tears, to stop crying, but she responds with a question asking how she could intend to leave her behind and leave. Heir had told Da to remain, but she kept on insisting. Heir finally explains to her that she didn't want her to suffer, that's why, and she says it's not like she's upset, but she's let down by the prince. Da questions how a groom could abandon his bride on the wedding night and leave first. Heir asks why she's disappointed since from the beginning it was only a marriage for peace, but Da replies questioning how he could change in just one night since he treated her so well the previous night. Even if it's just for a day, I'm grateful that he treated me well. I can't help it if he continues to treat me coldly from now on. It's a sin that Salar committed, Heir says. A person knocks on the window of the carriage and introduces himself as Ebn Renub, bearing a message from the prince to her. At the same time in the count's palace, a messenger informs him that the prince wasn't present in the delegation procession, and it is said that the prince is staying at Viscount Duen's place. The Count chuckles, asking if it's so, whether he really left that night. Great, I guess Heir still hasn't slept with that guy. In a new scene, the prince's assistant informs her that they'll soon pass through the canal and enter the Tricas area, and it'll probably be late at night. He also mentions that the prince has also arrived at the Dwen border and the delegation will remain there for a day. The assistant explains that because of urgent matters he had to leave early, so he wanted to apologize to her. They finally arrive at Dwen City, and as Heir continues raising questions about whether the prince would be joining anytime soon, his assistant takes her aside and informs her that the prince was poisoned and had fainted as a result. She asks if it could have been Salar, and he replies that it seems it was caused by tricks since the prince doesn't get along well with the rest of his half-brothers. He tells her it's fortunate that the poison was released early, although it's impossible for the prince to wake up immediately. He tells her it would have been complicated if Salar knew, so they made an excuse: first we brought the prince here and then gathered here later, sorry for not being able to tell you in advance. She asks if the prince is in stable condition, and the assistant replies that he would still need rest, so it would be good if she can spend the night in the room next to his. Please keep His Highness' condition a secret from the others. Later in the room, as she prepares for bed, Da asks if she's been able to meet with the prince since he wasn't even at dinner. Hinali, reflecting on how his condition also needs to be kept a secret from Da, replies that she met him and he appeared to be busy, even having dinner in his room. Da then suggests she sleeps outside just in case the prince changes his mind and decides to pay her a visit at night. Later, as she lays in bed, the cold wind from the window causes her to shiver, and when she gets up, a man creeps up behind her with a blindfold. In a flash, he escaped from the guards and escaped from the city, and when she realizes that it'll be more difficult for anyone to find her if he takes her deep into the forest, she pulls the ribbon from her hair, leaving it as a clue. At the same time in the city, the prince finally wakes up and his assistant hands him a cup of water. He also informs him that he's been asleep for 2 days, and when he asks about the princess, his assistant assures him that she also arrived safely. Just as they're discussing, Da rushes to them pleading for help. "Your Highness, Heir is missing," she announces tearfully. The prince's assistant questions whether they should form a search party, suggesting that they could pick at least 10 out of the 30 knights protecting the delegation, but the prince just says he'll go alone. His assistant rushes after him, reminding him that he just woken up, and the prince replies that if the knights make a move there will be bad rumors and it'll be fastest and quickest if I go alone. However, his assistant still argues that if even the prince goes missing, others will quickly notice that they're both gone, and the prince suggests he makes up some reasonable story. He tells him to be considerate of the princess, who is unfamiliar with Tricas, and say that they went on a honeymoon, just the two of them. His assistant pauses before replying that his suggestion is too romantic, and then asks if he thinks people will believe it, but the prince replies that back when he was in Salar he did something stupid with the princess, so people will believe it for sure. You can continue with the gang, leaving Dwen and heading west to Tubin. Meet me in 3 days, the prince says. The prince assures him that he will make it possible, as the culprit is either Cheddar the madman or the third prince. The culprit continues heading north until he finally pauses and brings her down the horse. "Nice to meet you again, Your Highness. I told you, Heir, I will definitely save you," she hears Cheddar say. She slowly retreats, but the culprit blacks her. Cheddar takes her hand and kisses it, saying it's fortunate that the prince hasn't touched her yet. "You're mine." She senses a feeling of déjà vu in the air, and when she realizes it's Nuhal Mountain, she begins sobbing, but he comforts her, saying if her face gets wet the cold wind will hurt her. As she wonders whether it's her destiny to be tied to him and whether it was also her child's destiny in the past, she pushes him away and immediately hurries away. Cheddar orders the man to catch her without leaving a scratch on her, but she only hurries faster, thinking not to repeat the same fate this time. As she hurries, the culprit's hand reaches for her and she trips. He holds her down, and finally Cheddar arrives. He orders him to stop unless her body will be damaged, and as he looks at her revealing sleepwear, he takes off his cape and wraps it around her. The culprit reminds him about the money he promised, but as he looks down at the scratches on her chest, he fumes with anger. "I thought I told you to bring her here without a single scratch." The man apologizes, saying he had no idea she would try to escape like that, but he doesn't forgive and instead stabs him. Filled with terror, she trembles, but Cheddar comforts her and says he had no other choice. He tells her not only did he injure her, but he also dared to look at his woman, so he can't let him live. Later, Cheddar cleans her leg with a towel, and as she trembles, he tells her she seems to be very frightened. She asks where she is, and he tells her they're in his mansion in Shermau City, a life for just the two of them at a place where no one can find them. Isn't it romantic? Cheddar Phil is crazy. She thinks before asking what Mia is going to do since he's already married to her, but he replies that he'll think about it himself while she just needs to rest comfortably. Her expression suddenly changes, but Cheddar tells her not to resist him like that because it'll only increase his desire to lay down with her. He tells her he doesn't want to start the first night with her unprepared body. He rests his head against her leg, murmuring softly about how smooth her skin feels. Suddenly, he pushes her onto the bed, demanding to know what she's thinking about when she's next to him. "Let me warm you up with my body temperature," he says with his head all in her skin. In a new scene, a bird lands on the prince's hand. He gives the almoner to the bird and tells it to come back to him in time. He thinks about how maging seek will eliminate the poison. In other words, the further he is away from it, the stronger the demonic energy will be. The instinct of a beast has dominated him ever since he was young. Using his instinct, he searches and finally sees her ribbon that she dropped as a clue. At the same time in the mansion, Cheddar tells Heir that whenever he touches her skin he can't endure it anymore. "I'll warm you up with my body." He pushes her further into the bed, but she stops him. "Cheddar, I don't like us being like this. It feels like I'm being forced." Heir tells him even though their relationship became distant due to her father's decision, she knows he loves her very much. She tells him she also wants him to give her a tender, loving embrace, but after she warms up a bit. Cheddar agrees with her and informs her that he was afraid someone will disturb their time together, so he'd gotten rid of all the servants and he'll heat up the bath water himself. He encourages her to wait for a while and then proceeds to go down to heat up the water, leaving her alone in the room. Once he leaves, she hurries to the window and checks the distance before taking the curtains and making a rope with them. After some time, Cheddar arrives in the room with a smile, but his expression quickly changes once he spots Heir trying to escape from the balcony. He rushes to her, and just before she can jump, he grabs her hand and pulls her back. He throws her onto the bed. Standing annoyed, he demands to know what she just attempted to do. He grabs her by her neck, asking how daring she is to be able to trick him like that. He reminds her that she has the half-blood of a servant and says she should be grateful when she has a chance to receive his love. "It's not enough that you reject me and not know your place, now you dare to look down on me," he asks. He lets her go and she drops onto the bed. "With your face like that, I can't be in a good mood, so I must treat it. Remember, if you dare reject me again, I'll make you have a nightmare on the first night." The prince finally gets to where the culprit Wazuna lived, and it isn't long until he senses her scent from the building in the distance. In the building, Cheddar informs her that he'll be going to the capital to get some medicine, and if she dares run away again, he'll make it so she can't walk anymore. Heir bites her nail in fear as she questions if the prince would accept her if Cheddar continues tormenting her like that. Becoming a slave to Cheddar, I might end up living a life worse than before. She encourages herself not to lose hope so soon and goes to grab an arrow, waiting patiently behind the door to strike when he arrives again. He arrives and she notices he doesn't open the door with the key. In an instant, the door is blown away, and when she spots the prince, he notices the item in her hand and asks if she's going to hit him with that. She hugs him and thanks him for coming, but he takes a closer look at her and asks what is wrong with her face. She explains that when she was about to escape he caught her, but the prince didn't let her finish and says he didn't expect him to be so ruthless. He undresses, and as she urges him to go quickly before Cheddar returns, he lifts her up, saying that way will be faster. As they return, they run into Cheddar on the steps. He draws his sword and asks how he'd gotten there, but the prince replies that he thought him to be crazy since the beginning, but he didn't think he was crazy enough to lay his hands on the prince of the Trika's empire. Cheddar flees, and as the prince realizes that he'd summoned his knights, he asks her to remain behind. He goes to Cheddar, who informs him that the knights will arrive soon. He tells him to give her to him and he'll spare his life, but the prince instead asks who'd given him the order. They get into a fight and the prince quickly strikes him down. He swings his sword again, taking one of his fingers. If you want to keep your remaining fingers, then confess quickly. The prince asks again who he received orders from, but he doesn't respond, so the prince kicks him in the face, and this time he loses his tooth. The prince places his leg in his head and repeats the question. Cheddar thinks to endure everything, putting hope in the reinforcements, but the prince asks if he believes that simply waiting for the escort knights to arrive is enough. 11 people, black shirt and red cloak, is that right? The prince asks. The prince then asks a last time who'd given him the order, and this time he reveals that it was Kyle, the third prince of Trikas, and he was only doing as he was told. The prince stands up, and before leaving the prince strikes him again. This is a punishment for daring to touch my wife. When Heir senses everything has gone quiet, she goes down and she looks in terror when she spots a tooth lying around. The prince gives her Cheddar's boot to wear, and when she asks if Cheddar is still alive, he responds that he hasn't finished him off just yet and things will only become more complicated. They get outside and the prince's assistant arrives shortly afterwards. The prince picks her up and places her on the horse after ordering them to go get some clothes for Heir from the carriage. He suggests she holds onto his waist when she tells him she doesn't know how to ride a horse. Later in the carriage, Heir wonders if the prince is sleeping, reflecting on how he'd worked all night just to save her. She questions whether to go sit outside, but rethinks it after she considers that the flow of energy might become even more chaotic. "Your Highness, are you having a fever?" she asks as she reaches for his face. The prince wakes up and immediately grabs her hand, asking if he hadn't mentioned for her to stay still. She gasps when she notices the position of her leg and then maintains a distance in the carriage afterwards. She thinks to lighten the mood and then asks the prince how he'd found her. The prince replies that it was thanks to her ribbon, and he found it caught in the bushes. She tells him she secretly dropped it hoping it could be a clue, and he did find her. She gets curious and asks how he was able to make it up to the villa with just a ribbon, but he remains quiet. Hinali suggests to the prince that they stop the carriage and rest for a bit. "You were poisoned and only woke up a day ago. You've overflexed yourself looking for me. It would be better to stop the carriage and rest for a while," she continues. She advises him to go down and rest a bit, and he agrees, so they end up taking an inn. Inside, the prince orders his assistant to let the aide Renouveau be aware that they'll be late by half a day. Hinali remains in the room alone with the prince, who orders her to leave with them. She tells him he has a fever, so he'll need a wet cloth, but he still insists on her leaving. Hinali doesn't hesitate further and goes to him and says he's all alone, so he looks tired from all the moving around, so he'll have to change clothes. The scent of a woman's skin grows stronger and he grabs her hand and pulls her onto the bed with him. "If you undress me now, do you think I'll just let you go politely? In front of a starving beast, don't exude the smell of blood," he tells her. He tells her to leave because if she doesn't, she'll end up experiencing her first night there. He proceeds to get up, but she pulls him back down and says she's fine even if it is there. She tells him she's his wife and she vowed to fulfill all her duties as a wife completely, so she'll do as he wishes. She leans in for a kiss while the prince tries to hold himself back, thinking at the moment he's only being driven by instinct. "There will be blood, everyone will be scared again and look at me like I'm a monster." He thinks he must push her away as she proceeds to get on top of him, but he ends up giving in, and in a flash he notices the demonic energy that erupted earlier calms down. "The scent of a woman's skin, doing this, does it make me feel good?" he questions. When she notices him calming down, she suggests he take a bath first, and since he is yet to have a proper meal, while he's taking a bath, she'll ask them to prepare the food. While the prince reflects on how he thought he would become a beast if he held a woman in his arms, so he's always avoided it, but it's strange that he no longer feels that way. There is no curtain as the inn is mostly used by mercenaries and the prince was reluctant to reveal their identities. She turns her head away from the prince, suggesting he gets into the bathwater quickly, but he asks if she shouldn't help him bathe. He tells her he thought she said she'll do it and then mentions that she also has to bathe anyways. He suggests they take their bath together and then asks if it isn't also a wife's duty. She gives in and says if he wants it she'll help him, but as she begins to undress, he tells her to stop and says she changed his mind so she should go out. She asks if she's done anything wrong and he says no and explains that that night is the wedding night between them and it doesn't feel right if they spend their first night at a motel. He concludes that they should spend the night separately and then return to the palace and pick another date. Heir can't shake off the feeling of rejection that she thinks, if she misses the chance and he loses interest in her body again, she doesn't know how long she'll have to wait, and it might even be longer than yes. She speaks and tells the prince that before he'd mentioned that it's fine if she stays there. His eyes widens as he watches her dress slip from her body. She tells him to do as he wishes and wherever it's up to him before getting into the bathwater. She takes his hand and kisses it and he reciprocates this time. The prince kisses her and suddenly stops. "I don't want to be here, this space is too little, I'm afraid I might hurt you, let's get on the bed." He picks her up and takes her to the bed and then picks up from where they left before. She hesitates and the prince asks if she doesn't want it, but she replies that she's a little worried. "If it hurts, tell me," he murmurs, his touch gentle as she clings to him. Her breathing trembles, and soon, silent tears slip down her cheeks. The next morning the prince wakes her up and suggests they have breakfast before leaving. He spits the red marks on her body and asks if it is red because of him. She tells him the strangulation marks were caused by the count and the rest were caused by him. Her mind drifts to how she'd pleaded with him to stop, saying she could no longer endure it, but he'd responded that he can't stop and she'll endure it. He also mentioned how she said she'll do everything he wanted. On the lunch table, she dozes off while the prince is lost in thought. "I didn't mean to lose my mind and rush in like that. How did I become like that in an instant? Is it because I was separated from the statue and my instincts overpowered my reason?" The prince describes the feeling as a floating feeling, as if on clouds. It had felt so good that he wondered what was going on. He finally notices and tells her to stop nodding off. He gives her the fish he deboned and after she finishes eating she asks if they shall depart immediately. "Before we leave," Heir turns and he grabs her, "we need to do it one more time." She asks if it has to be at that time and he replies that he had to endure all night because she fell asleep. Later in the carriage, the prince turns to her and asks if it's difficult to sit and she replies that she can manage. The prince shares the schedule with her and then suggests she gets some sleep instead of worrying about her maid. She tells the prince he's the one keeping her awake and he goes closer and places her head on his shoulder. They arrive at Hawick and as Da and Heir embrace each other, the prince's assistant informs him that there's something that needs his attention. In private, the prince's assistant informs him that it was just as he'd said, the third prince was behind everything, and also adds that he'd confirmed that the mercenaries at Dwyn Castle received funds from the royal family and have started to move. His assistant tells that in any case it's all a plot to kidnap the princess consort. The prince then says he can't even drag Cheddar to the Empire as a witness because even if he did, he wouldn't testify properly. He explains that everyone would accuse him of arguing with the Count of Salar as a peace envoy, so trying to resolve everything in the public I would put him at a disadvantage. His assistant gets annoyed and asks if the prince hasn't fought his entire life for the Empire, but he just asks what it would matter now since they are the scum who would be satisfied only if he passed away on the battlefield. The assistant brings up the princess and the prince says compared to what he was worried about it's better. His assistant speaks about her face looking exhausted and the prince replies that he thought she would be terrified but she was surprisingly brave. "Are you pleased with her?" his assistant asks again, but the prince acts confused. His assistant then says he thought he was late because of the pain, but that appeared to not be the case. Did you rush through your first night of love in a place like that? Later, as Heir rides in the carriage, Da advises her to close the window of the carriage to avoid getting cold. The prince riding on his horse can't stop the memories from the night they'd spent together from flooding in. What is this feeling? When possessed by magic, all that's left for me is the primal instinct of a beast. Even my own family didn't want to come close to me. To be embraced in someone's arms, to live a normal married life, I couldn't imagine it, not once. In the end, they would be afraid of me and want to escape, so it's better not to fork any emotions from the start. He recalls his condition for their marriage and the night they'd shared together and thinks there's no guarantee he'll be so fortunate again. If I'm unlucky, I might tear my wife apart with these hands. He reminds himself of the condition for their marriage. They can't have any emotions for each other beyond producing an heir. They finally arrive at the imperial capital, Tayabon. The carriage stops, and as she wonders what's going on, the prince tells her to let the maid out, as from there she'll enter with him. He gets into the carriage and explains that he told them they were delayed because they were enjoying their honeymoon together, so they need to make a bit of a scene for it to seem natural. He proposed they pretend they're madly in love. He reminds her that in Salar he proposed in a grand way, which led everyone to conclude that he was madly in love with her. At least let's act perfectly until we meet His Majesty the Emperor. And don't misunderstand my act for sincerity, he says. Heir, lost in thought, wonders if he was being gentle that night because he was in a good mood. It makes sense, he did say he wouldn't care for me at all. He gives her a cloth and asks her to cover her face with it before they go in. It's not a tradition, but you can't go in looking like that. He also gives her a small box, and when she opens it she finds a piece of jewelry. He tells her he told Evan to go get it and then suggests she tries it on to see if it covers the bruises on her neck properly. She tries it on and the prince remains stiff for a while. Heir asks if she can return it later, but he just asks why she would want to and asks her not to be so casual about it. When entering the palace, keep your mouth shut and be silent. There are many other things to focus on except you, he says. They enter the palace and the prince introduces his new wife, but his parents raise questions about the veil covering her face. The prince replies that she is shy to meet them, so she covers her face, but the queen doesn't let it slide and points out that he's acting against protocol. What rudeness is this when introducing a new member of the royal family? The queen orders her to remove her veil, and just as she hesitates, the prince stops her and the queen looks at him with hostility. The prince asks if she's okay before raising the veil a little, as Your Majesty can see she can't control her strength. He tells them his wife seems embarrassed and pleads that they allow her to cover her face. The king bursts out laughing and saying it seems he's really interested in women and permits the princess to remain with the veil on. The emperor tells him he still recalls the moments on the battlefield where he defended Trikas. The prince replies that now that he's married, he should enjoy a relaxed mood too because he's fallen in love with the princess and he's trying to do the same, but if there's still blood flowing, one is still not satisfied with one wife. A statement which seems to annoy the king. He calls Heir and says the princess can also become the head of the family and he hopes she will support her husband and contribute to the prosperity of the Trikas royal family, but the prince calls him out saying he's wrong. He tells him now that she's married to him she shouldn't be called a princess, and as a member of the royal family she should be treated like a princess consort. Prince Viand is the legitimate son of the late queen and Mistress Psyche became the queen. However, it was rumored that the son of the mistress now held the real power. However, for Viand, even after making significant contributions in the war, he is still treated coldly by the royal family. The emperor bounces that the welcome party will be postponed by a day because the prince arrived late. The prince clenches his fist as he reflects on how his mother was just queen by name, as his father sought his mistress and his mother had birthed him hoping to receive his love, but after realizing that the curse of the Trikas family had been placed upon him he was desperate. His mother, who longed for love but could not receive it, died of suffering, and the mistress was appointed queen immediately after his mother passed away, as if she had been waiting for that for a long time. From that moment the prince had made a determination: he will not die yearning for love that he can't receive. Heinil reaches for the prince but he only yells at her and she explains that she was telling him to pretend to be in love. He takes her hand and asks if it's like that, and as they walk, he tells her not to misunderstand the day he hugged her was just to clarify the reason for the delay in returning. She smiles at him and says she will cooperate with his plan as acting is just perfect. In a new scene, Da panics over what the princess consort should wear to the welcome party. She tells her they'd left in a hurry so she wasn't able to pack well and after pulls out a box saying it's the most suitable one and Heinil gasps once she spots the dress in it. Later, she arrives at the hall in a red dress with a shawl over it and can feel the gaze of everyone on her. A lady and a man notice her standing and head towards her but she turns around and he ends up spilling his wine on her shawl revealing the elaborate cutout in front of the dress. The man introduces himself as the third Prince Kyle Viant and then says he's heard rumors of the boldness of the southern women but he didn't expect it to be that much. He tells her he thought his brother wasn't interested in women but it turns out that he has a keen eye for bold women like her. However, she remains unfazed and greets him. She tells them it appears she's made them all uncomfortable due to her ignorance of the northern culture but since she only left after the marriage, she's yet to understand the culture of Tricos. Please be generous and understanding towards me. I send my greetings to the third prince and princess consort. I hope you will take care of me. After the prince leaves, the nobles present begin murmuring amongst themselves whether the southern women dress like that because of the hot weather. At the same time the prince enters the hall and searches frantically for Heinil until he spots her. She asks to borrow his shawl and he gives it to her and asks that they talk for a while. On the balcony, he asks what she was thinking of dressing like that and she apologizes saying the clothes she'd gotten from Salar are all thin and she also doesn't have anything that matches the necklace. With unsteady breath, she explains that she planned to use a shawl to cover it but because the third prince spilled wine. She apologizes again for harming his dignity but he instead takes the blame and says because he left in a hurry he didn't have time to prepare proper clothes for her. He tells her he was so distracted by the kidnapping that he forgot and apologizes. He informs her that he will assign someone to teach her the etiquette of Tricos and prepare new clothes as well. He tells her it's not the clothes that are inappropriate since in Salar everyone dresses like that as well. He tells her maybe the third prince deliberately offended her to belittle him and as his wife it will continue to happen in the future. He also reminds her his warning in the beginning that she has no power to enjoy when she becomes a prince consort. She tells the prince she's all set now and she was the one who requested that he take her as his wife so she will handle everything. They go back inside and Heinil reflects on how the present queen has reached the peak of power and the first prince has usurped the throne from Retz Viant the crown prince and the third prince takes over the palace while his brother is ill. They all die within 2 years and you will become the emperor of the empire Retz Viant. Inside she thanks him for letting her borrow his cloak when someone says she arrived in such a unique outfit and everyone keeps talking about the princess's clothes. Since the second prince is completely smitten with the princess I assume you wear attire like this all day in Salar, the queen says. Viant is displeased with how she addresses Heinil and she asks if the wedding wasn't yet to be held in Tricos and according to the royal law he's still not a royal consort. The prince asks if she can't be a bit flexible with someone soon to join the royal family and she responds that flexibility at the wrong time leads to indulgence. If I didn't exercise flexibility, these families present here could have been wiped out entirely, he says, which displeases the queen. The Bolton family, the Paymek, the Sens, they've become a resource for forces challenging the throne, lurking like predators so what difference is there between these people and Tricos' enemy nations? He reminds her that if he hadn't stopped them with his sword both her and the king might not be sitting on the throne presently. A man amongst the nobles speaks up and states that it's treason and it has already been transparently clarified that they were also deceived by them. The man continues and says to prove their loyalty they gave part of their territory to him and then asks if he didn't personally grant them amnesty. He asks why he's bringing that up and the prince replies that he doesn't treat his wife as family and he just wanted to know if he's forgotten that he's his son. The king then says he hopes the wedding soon holds and she formally joins the royal family before leaving. Heir apologizes to the prince for causing trouble, but he asks her not to get the wrong idea, asking if she thinks it's because of her. He tells her even if it weren't, they'd find some excuse to oppress him, and she's only enduring it because of him. The prince orders Evan to take Heir to the prince's quarters, but a man named Heir comes to pay his greeting. The prince advises him not to bother someone who's trying to rest, and he asks if he's afraid the wolves will come lurking, so he's sending her off early. Heir replies that his compassion is too great to leave a lonely person unattended, but they end up leaving. In the room, Heir asks Evan if Lord Heir is a part of the royal family, and he replies that he's the country's prime minister. Later at night, as Da gets Heir ready, the prince arrives and he orders Da to leave them alone together. Standing in front of him, she wonders if something had happened when suddenly he embraces her. He tells her not to wear the outfit she'd worn earlier again, as he had to restrain himself from gouging out the eyes of the men who were staring non-stop at her. She apologizes and says he's endured a lot, so she'll be more mindful from then on, and he kisses her. How strange, just another crap day as usual, but somehow like this it makes it feel like it's no big deal. The prince further questions why her touch makes him feel so at peace. This woman is my wife, to stay by my side, in my arms and bear my child. He gently pushes her onto the bed. Your Highness, Heir calls, maybe as a signal to stop, but the prince continues and says they need to have a child. You want it too, he ends. Heir asks him to wait, saying she has to take a shower first and afterwards she'll go to the palace. The prince suggests they take a bath together, and she reminds him that he'd said that the last time, but he ended up doing something else anyway. The prince agrees and asks that she comes quickly, and as she pushes him out she tells him she'll be as quick as possible. In the bath, Da asks Heir if the prince was annoyed because of the outfit she wore to the banquet, and she responds that it seemed he was having a hard time because of her. As Da wonders what the princess should wear when going to soothe the prince, she spots the gift her mom had given her, and mistaking it as essential oil, she adds it to the bath water. Later, the prince stands in front of the door when he notices Da coming with a tray. She explains that the princess is taking a bath and had complained that her throat was dry, so she was planning on getting her a drink. The prince takes the tray from her and goes to meet Heir, who reflects on events that had happened that day. She hears the door open and, thinking it's Da, she asks her for a towel, but when she doesn't get a response, she turns her head and finds the prince himself standing. He pulls her out of the water and begins kissing her. She asks him to wait, but instead he sweeps her off her feet, resulting in her pushing him away. She notices the look in his eyes and wonders why he's suddenly behaving like that, since he was never that kind of person. Please be gentle, is that okay? Like that time I wanted to do it, in bed. The prince, on the other hand, is unable to concentrate because of the scent that makes only his desire clear. He pulls out the almoner and asks that she repeat herself, and this time she tells him where they seem slippery, so she's scared. I want to go to bed. She notices the prince doesn't respond and constantly calls out to him, but he only responds by picking her up and throwing her onto the bed. He takes her leg and leaves a bite mark on her neck. Your Highness, it hurts gently, she says. The prince notices himself losing control even more than last time, and his next move causes her to panic. She begs the prince to wait for a while, but he responds that he can't hold back any longer and embraces her. After a while she lies in bed wondering how many times it has been already and manages to mutter that she's exhausted. She suggests they rest a little, but he only asks her to give up that thought since he'd already told her that wasn't an option. As she endures, she thinks not to expect anything since she's just a tool to produce an heir. She recalls her father's last words to her before she left, and she calls herself a fool since even after being treated badly by Cheddar she still acts like an idiot. Cheddar once cherished me, but in the end he was just as cruel. Don't expect anything after all, my only purpose is to bear an heir. Just surrender this body to him, don't think about anything else. The next morning, the prince sits awake in bed. He turns to Heir and gets a faint memory of the past night together, how she'd pleaded with him to stop. Why does this madman have to go to such extremes? I tried to restrain myself to avoid this, but I lost control. The prince questions why he keeps losing control like that and reflects on how the last time he was being controlled, so he separated the almoner from his body for a while, and they said it was due to disrupted energy flow, but that time that wasn't the case. The prince begins to question whether it's as true as people say, whether he's truly a crazed beast. He questions whether Heir will fear and avoid him when seeing him act like such a terrifying creature. The prince adjusts the blanket and thinks, I don't want Heir to treat me like this, just like me back then. He spots the marks on her hand and thinks that it looks even more serious, and he wants to apologize and be forgiven. I don't want you to hate me, why do I always want that from you, he questions. Later, a person comes and asks the prince if he will be eating with the princess consort, and he says yes he will once she wakes up. The prince recalls how she'd enjoyed chicken the last time and requests for it to be made and also some fresh fruit to be eaten with the meal. The prince goes back inside and his eyes widened in surprise upon finding her awake. She sobs quietly from the sore and the prince offers her a cup of water, which she accepts. About last night, the prince speaks, but she interrupts and says it's all right and she understands why he acted in that way. Thank you so much for watching, guys. Don't forget to leave and like and subscribe, and also don't forget to share your thoughts on this video in the comments or leave a comment for part 2.